Let's just dial back into the voice debate, shall we? Because there's been some interesting developments today or over the weekend with the Prime Minister saying that if a yes vote is successful, there will be a bipartisan parliamentary committee that will help work on its design. Does that mean that we're now in bipartisan territory on this and that there is a constructive way forward in the event? I have to say, given the polls, it looks like the unlikely event that a yes campaign is possible. Or is there less to this than meets the eye? Well, Keith Waleed has a view. He's the Liberal MP for the northeastern Melbourne seat of Menzies. He was deputy chair of the parliamentary committee that looked into the voice referendum and is with us now. Keith Waleed, thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me, Waleed, and good morning to your listeners.
This seems like a reasonable proposal from the Prime Minister, doesn't it?
It does, but I wish that sort of reasonable proposal was there back when we had the committee established to look at the wording of the question that was put to the people. I think that was the time for reasonable bipartisanship, and we just didn't have it.
All right, so what are you saying, that you don't like what the Prime Minister did previously, therefore you think this is irrelevant, or you don't like this particular proposal? What's the argument here?
I think this is relevant, but it feels like it's driven more by campaign tactics rather than the actual best outcome for the question and for the country. When we had the committee have hearings in April, we only had 5 days to consider a whole new chapter and quite a significant proposal that was put to the people. 5 days. We never had a constitutional convention. And at the end of all of that, not one word was changed, not a word. And we sought to be constructive on that committee. We had a dissenting report that proposed 4 options to wind back legal risk. And all 4 of those were backed by proponents of the voice. So even though they were critical of the model, they still now support it. I acknowledge that. But they were ridiculed at the time. And I think a lot of that had to do with the state of the polls at the time, and that's a shame.
Right, but what's the argument over here? Is it effectively this idea that the voice would be able to make representations to executive government rather than just the parliament? Is that the nub of your concern?
Certainly, and it was certainly the nub of their concern. So we heard, a variety of legal experts, and many said, look, there's nothing to see here. Part 2 is fine. Most of it's fixed by Part 3 through the parliament. But we heard many experts say otherwise. And so when we had Julian Leeser propose a model that removed Part 2, there was quite fierce resistance for that. And the problem with all of that is that on the one hand, we were told that there's no real implied or expressed powers in Part 2 because it's fixed by Part 3. If you accept that, then you say, well, why wouldn't you remove Part 2? And there's no answer to that. And one of the answers to that would have been to see a bill, an example of what the voice would have looked like. Then we could have said, well, which part of this bill needs Part 2? And I can't see what part of a bill would need Part 2. And we see that in the polling. Redbridge did a poll in September that gave reasons for why people are voting yes or no. And about 19% of the no vote is driven by a variety of different expressions of legal risk. So it does matter. And I think it's a reason the polling is where it is. We
need to break down that 19% though, because legal risk is a very broad concept, and we're seeing all kinds of, at worst misinformation and disinformation, at best sort of very tenuous argumentation about what the legal consequences of a voice might be, right through to, they're going to make you pay the rent on your property, or you might even lose your property, these sorts of things. If that's the kind of legal risk that are talking about, or that people are talking about, that's certainly prevailing on social media. Do any of these arguments about Part 1, Part 2, Part 3 really make any difference to the way people are voting?
I think it does. And look, no doubt there is misinformation on both sides. I accept that. But the way we conducted and approached the committee was, we didn't run any arguments like third chamber or veto. I accept that they're not valid reasons. But there were valid criticisms of the voice to the executive, particularly in potential obligations of consultation and consideration. There are existing obligations that exist in administrative law. Now, again, there was legal experts who would have different views on that, but none could eliminate the risk.
No, but the majority held that it wasn't much of a risk, didn't they? I mean, certainly several former High Court judges made the point, if you're worried about the voice miring government in litigation, then the High Court will always, as a matter of constitutional law, as a constitutional principle, read down any provision that would do that. It can't read the Constitution in a way that would gum up the gears of government, basically. And so the risk is very minimal.
No, I understand that the way that that's put, but the response to risk can't be judged by counting the number of lawyers for and against a particular argument. The fact is, serious experts, including former High Court and Federal Court judges, gave conflicting evidence about the risk. And we thought that is enough cause for the Parliament to take the issue seriously and take steps to eliminate it. And there was no good faith returned in seeking to reduce that risk. But there's also a political element to it, Waleed. I know there were some Liberals that were ready to move if there was some give on the model, and it just wasn't there. And I'm sure that was reflected in the community as well.
We've seen High Court judges, though, retired High Court judges, make the point that whatever risk there is that attaches to, say, the Voice's power to make representations to executive government, that part of what could curtail that is the parliamentary response. So the legislation that would define the way the Voice works. The Prime Minister has now just proposed a body that would help design that legislation would be bipartisan. Can't all of your concerns be met in that process? In which case, shouldn't you be backing that process and saying that this is the way that we can deal with concerns about scope, remit, intrusive litigation, etc.?
You can back the process of bipartisanship on the other side of a successful referendum and still criticise the lack of bipartisanship earlier, because Part 3 of the Parliament's powers is subject to this Constitution, which means that if there are any express or implied powers in Part 2, then there's nothing the Parliament can do about it, nothing. And if the Parliament could do all of those things that the Prime Minister and the Attorney-General said, then Part 2 has no work to do. And that's the nub of this. If Part 2 has no work to do, then eliminate it. And I think there would have been a political upside to that. To hold on to it is either bloody-minded or it shows that Part 2 actually had real power. And that's what we suspect that it does.
Just before I let you go, we've seen, I think we can all agree, some fairly concerning scenes with some of the no protesting that happened over the weekend. I'm thinking here particularly of some neo-Nazi groups standing alongside those protests, holding up signs. I'm not going to say what those signs said. There's not really much point in doing that, but you get the point. Are you concerned about the way, I don't know, what would we call this, some of the satellite groups that have attached themselves to the No campaign?
I'm concerned about that sort of display in a variety of issues, including here in The Voice. I'm particularly concerned about this whole debate has led to division in our community. And I've only been in Parliament just over a year, but I do speak to colleagues who've been there for decades. And they all say that they've never seen political tensions higher in Australia than they are now. And we've still got almost 3 weeks to go till the referendum. I think the onus on all of us is to call out division and hate when we see it, but also to try and bring the tone down, to not attack the person, to address arguments, and to all agree that we can disagree and then respect the result on the night, no matter what that is. Do
you think that leaders of the No campaign, including, I should point out, your boss, has been abiding by that brief that you've just provided?
I think he has. I think he's putting the argument forcefully and clearly, and he passionately believes in it, as do I. But I know that colleagues who passionately believe the S case back their position. And my good friend is Julian Lisa, and we disagree on this issue. We can socialise and get together and laugh. And I think we need all Australians to do that through this process and afterwards.
Keith, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Waleed.
Keith Wallachan, Liberal MP for the North Eastern Melbourne seat of Menzies, Deputy Chair of the Parliamentary Committee that looked into the Voice referendum.